The air beneath Moor Basin Delta carried the weight of 1,000 unmarked graves. Sergeant Voss pressed his gloved hand against the collapsed wall of the reliquary trench, feeling the dampness seep through leather and cloth. The black soil here never dried, not even under the pale sun that struggled through the perpetual smoke of the forward positions. Everything in this cursed delta held moisture like a sponge holds blood. The excavation had taken 3 days. 3 days of hauling rotted timber and chunks of corroded masonry, while the distant rumble of artillery reminded them that the war never slept. Private Henrik worked beside him, his young face already marked by the particular pallor that came from breathing the air of the corpse hives. The boy had volunteered for the dig detail, eager to prove himself worthy of the forward trenches. "Another beam here, Sergeant," Henrik called, his voice muffled by the cloth wrapped around his mouth and nose. The fabric had turned gray with dust and worse things. "Looks like it goes deep." Voss nodded and signaled to the other diggers. Corporal Thain and Private Mockridge moved with the practiced efficiency of men who had spent months pulling bodies from collapsed positions. They knew the weight of death, how it settled into timber and stone, how it made everything heavier than it should be. The reliquary trench had been a shrine once, back when the Crusade still believed in clean victories and righteous warfare. Now it was just another hole in the ground, filled with the debris of faith and the remnants of prayers that had failed to turn aside the enemy's shells. The brass plaques that had once declared the glory of forgotten saints were green with verdigris, their inscriptions eaten away by the acid rain that fell every third night. "What's that?" Mockridge pointed to something dark protruding from beneath a slab of carved stone. "Looks like metal." Voss knelt and brushed away the accumulated filth. His fingers found the curve of what might have been a pauldron, thick with rust and encrusted with substances that felt wrong against his skin. The metal was warm, though they were 20 feet below ground level where the sun never reached. "Careful now," he said, though he could not explain why the words came out as a whisper. "Let's see what we have." They worked in silence after that. The usual chatter of soldiers engaged in tedious labor faded as they uncovered more of the thing buried beneath the rubble. It was clearly a suit of armor, but unlike anything Voss had seen in his 15 years of service. The plates were fused together with chains that had been driven through the metal itself, creating a web of iron that seemed to pulse with its own dark rhythm. The helmet was the worst part. Where a face should have been, there was only a grill of corroded metal, twisted into shapes that suggested screaming mouths, or perhaps the maw of some predatory insect. Behind the grill, darkness gathered like pooled ink, and sometimes Voss thought he could see the faint gleam of what might have been eyes. "It's holding something," Henrik said, his voice tight with an emotion Voss could not identify. "In its hands." The armored figure clutched a pickaxe, its wooden handle black with age and use. The metal head was etched with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed directly, as if the runes were carved not into the surface but into the viewer's perception itself. The weapon was massive, far too heavy for any normal man to wield, yet it rested in the thing's grip as if it weighed nothing at all. "We need to report this," Voss said, though he made no move to leave. Something about the armored figure held him, drew his attention like a lodestone draws iron. Command will want to know. But none of them moved. They stood in a circle around the excavated relic, watching as the last of the debris was cleared away. The thing sat on what appeared to be a throne of fused bones, its armored form upright and alert, despite the centuries it must have spent buried beneath the shrine. The chains that bound it to the throne were not restraints, Voss realized. They were part of it, grown into the metal like veins through living flesh. "Look at the inscriptions," Corporal Thain said, his voice barely audible. "On the base there." Voss looked where the corporal pointed. The throne was covered in text, carved in a script that predated the current crusade by centuries. The words were in Old Gothic, the sacred language of the first martyrs, but they were wrong somehow. The letters seemed to bend and twist, forming words that the eye could read but the mind could not quite accept. "Blessed be the workers in the deep places," Henrik read aloud, his voice taking on a strange cadence. "Blessed be those who toil in darkness for the glory of the ascending saint. Blessed be the faithful who carry the burden of the unclean, that they might be purified through suffering." "Stop reading," Voss said, but his voice lacked conviction. The words seemed to echo in the confined space of the excavation, bouncing off the walls of packed earth and corroded stone. "We should cover it back up." "No," Thain said, and there was something in his voice that made Voss look at him sharply. "Command needs to see this. It's a relic, a genuine artifact of the old crusade." The corporal was right, of course. In the endless war of attrition that had consumed the Delta, genuine relics were rare and precious things. They served as focal points for the faith of the common soldiers, reminders that their struggle was part of something larger and more meaningful than the daily grind of survival in the trenches. But this thing felt different. It radiated an aura of wrongness that made Voss's skin crawl, as if the very air around it was corrupted by its presence. The rust that covered its surface was not the honest corrosion of age and neglect, but something more organic, more deliberate. It formed patterns that suggested ritual scarification, as if the armor had been deliberately wounded and allowed to bleed metal. "We'll need lifting gear," Mockridge said, running his hands along the base of the throne. "This thing must weigh 1/2 ton. "More," Voss said. "Look at how deep it settled into the ground." The throne had sunk into the earth as if the weight of the armored figure had pressed it down through solid rock. The impression it left was perfect, as if the stone had been molded around its form while still soft. But that was impossible. The foundations of the reliquary trench were solid basalt, harder than iron. They spent the rest of the day rigging chains and pulleys, working by the light of corpse candles that burned with a pale, sickly flame. The wax was rendered from the fat of the faithful dead, and it was said that the light it produced could reveal the true nature of things. In the flickering glow, the armored figure seemed to shift and move, as if it were not quite solid, not quite real. The extraction took 6 hours. The relic came up slowly, reluctantly, as if it were fighting against their efforts. The chains groaned under the weight, and twice the pulleys threatened to give way entirely. But finally, with a sound like grinding bones, the throne broke free of the earth. The moment it lifted clear of the ground, the temperature in the excavation dropped 10 degrees. Their breath began to mist in the suddenly frigid air, and frost formed on the metal surfaces of their tools. The armored figure sat motionless on its throne, but somehow it gave the impression of watchfulness, as if it were aware of everything that transpired around it. "Get it topside," Voss ordered, his voice harsh in the cold air, "and send word to command. Tell them we found something." The journey to the surface was a nightmare of straining muscles and creaking machinery. The relic seemed to grow heavier with each foot they lifted it, as if it were drawing weight from the earth itself. The men hauled on the chains with desperate strength, their faces red with exertion and something that might have been fear. When they finally hauled the throne up to ground level, the sun was setting behind the smoke of the distant artillery barrage. The pale light that filtered through the perpetual haze seemed to recoil from the armored figure, leaving it wreathed in shadows despite the open sky above. "Mother of Martyrs," breathed Private Garrett, who had been waiting at the surface to help with the final lift. "What is that thing?" Voss had no answer. The relic squatted on its throne like a king of rust and corruption, its empty helmet turned toward the western horizon where the enemy lines lay hidden in the perpetual twilight. The pickaxe in its grip seemed to thrum with potential energy, as if it were eager to be used. "It's a sump saint," said a voice behind them. They turned to see Major Kellum approaching, his staff uniform pristine despite the muddy conditions. A genuine artifact from the founding days of the Crusade, magnificent. The Major walked around the relic, his eyes bright with something that might have been avarice. He had the look of a man who saw opportunity in everything, who could calculate the value of faith itself. "This will be perfect for morale," he continued, running his gloved hand along the arm of the throne. "The men need something to believe in, something to remind them that their sacrifice serves a greater purpose." "Sir," Voss said carefully, "perhaps we should have it examined first. By the chaplains or the tech, adepts. It's been buried for a long time." "Nonsense," Kellum replied. "Faith needs no examination. This is clearly a blessed relic, a martyr, engine of the old crusade. We'll have it mounted in the center of the forward trench, where every man can see it." Voss wanted to protest, but the words died in his throat. There was something about the Major's tone that brooked no argument, as if the decision had already been made by forces beyond their control. And perhaps it had. In the endless war of the Delta, decisions were often made by necessity rather than wisdom. The transport to the forward trench took most of the night. They loaded the relic onto a flatbed truck that groaned under its weight, the springs compressed almost flat by the impossible mass of the thing. The engine labored to pull its burden, belching black smoke that mixed with the perpetual haze of the battlefield. Voss rode in the cab beside the driver, watching the landscape crawl past in the pale light of the half-moon. The delta stretched away on either side, a wasteland of shell craters and abandoned positions. The corpse hives rose in the distance like diseased mountains, their sides crawling with the phosphorescent glow of decay. "Never seen anything like it," the driver said, his voice barely audible over the straining engine. "That thing back there feels like it's watching me." Voss glanced back at the relic through the rear window. The armored figure sat motionless on its throne, but he could have sworn the empty helmet had turned slightly, as if it were indeed observing their progress. The impression was so strong that he found himself checking the rearview mirror every few seconds, expecting to see the thing move. "Just keep driving," he said. The forward trench was a maze of interconnected passages and firing positions carved into the black soil of the delta. It stretched for miles in either direction, a scar across the landscape that marked the furthest advance of the crusade. Beyond it lay no man's land, a killing field swept by enemy fire and carpeted with the bones of the faithful. The men of the 3rd Penitent Company were waiting when they arrived. They had been fighting in the Delta for 8 months, long enough to develop the 1,000-yard stare that marked veterans of the endless war. Their uniforms were patched and repatched, their weapons clean to a shine that spoke of religious devotion rather than mere military discipline. "What's that, then?" asked Sergeant Malthorne, eyeing the covered relic with professional suspicion. "Another piece of junk from the rear echelon?" "It's a sump, Saint," Voss replied, though the words felt strange in his mouth. "A martyr, engine from the old crusade, command once it mounted as a morale focus." Malthorne spat into the mud. Morale focus. Right. Because what we really need is another piece of dead metal to remind us how glorious it is to die for the cause. But even as he spoke, the other men were gathering around the truck. Word had spread through the trench with the speed that only military gossip could achieve. A genuine relic, they whispered. A saint of the old crusade, a sign that their sacrifice was not in vain. The unveiling took place at dawn, when the pale sun cast long shadows across the cratered landscape. Major Kellum had arrived with a small retinue of staff officers and junior chaplains, all eager to witness the installation of the relic. The men of the 3rd Penitent Company stood in ranks, their faces reflecting a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. "Behold," Kellum announced as the canvas covering was pulled away, "the relic of the Sump Saint, a warrior of the old crusade, preserved by faith and blessed by suffering." The armored figure sat on its throne in the center of the trench, positioned where it could be seen from every firing position. In the morning light, it looked almost noble, a testament to the enduring power of faith in the face of endless war. The rust that covered its surface gleamed like dried blood, and the chains that bound it to the throne seemed to pulse with their own inner rhythm. "Let this be a reminder," the Major continued, "that we fight not for earthly glory, but for a cause that transcends death itself. This saint has watched over the faithful for centuries, and he will watch over us as well." The men cheered, though Voss thought he detected a note of uncertainty in their voices. The relic commanded respect, certainly, but it was the respect one might show to a dangerous animal rather than a holy artifact. There was something predatory about its stillness, as if it were waiting for the right moment to strike. The ceremony concluded with a brief prayer led by Chaplain Morse, a thin man whose fervor burned in his eyes like fever. He spoke of sacrifice and redemption, of the glory that awaited the faithful beyond the veil of death. But his words seemed to fall flat in the presence of the relic, as if the thing on the throne absorbed them like a sponge absorbs water. As the officers departed and the men returned to their duties, Voss found himself alone with the Sump Saint. The trench was quiet, except for the distant rumble of artillery and the occasional crack of a sniper's rifle. The armored figure sat motionless on its throne, but Voss could feel its attention like a physical weight. "What are you?" he whispered to the empty helmet. "What do you want?" The relic made no response, but Voss thought he heard something, a faint hissing that might have been whined through the corroded grill of the helmet. Or it might have been something else entirely, something that had no business in the world of the living. He shook his head and walked away, telling himself that the stress of the excavation was playing tricks on his mind. But as he left, he could feel the thing's gaze burning into his back, as if it were memorizing every detail of his retreat. The first incident happened 3 days later. Private Henrik was found at his post just before dawn, standing at attention with his rifle at port arms. He had been there all night, the other sentries reported, standing perfectly still despite the cold rain that had soaked through his uniform. "Henrik," Sergeant Multhorn called to him. "Stand down. Your watch is over." But the private did not respond. He stood frozen in place, his eyes fixed on the Sumpsaint's throne. Drool leaked from the corner of his mouth, and his breathing was so shallow that his chest barely moved. "Henrik." Multhorn grabbed the young man's shoulder and shook him. "Wake up, you bloody fool." The private's eyes snapped into focus, and he stumbled backward as if he had been struck. His face was pale, and his hands shook as he tried to understand where he was. "I was listening," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "to the sermons. He was preaching about the glory of work, about the joy of carrying burdens for the faithful. Such beautiful words." "Who was preaching?" Multhorn demanded. "There's no one here but us." Henrik looked confused. He glanced around the trench, then at the Sumpsaint, then back at his sergeant. "I don't know," he said. "I thought I heard voices." Multhorn sent him to the medical station, but the medic could find nothing wrong with him. His vital signs were normal, his reflexes sharp. But there was something in his eyes, a distant look that had not been there before. It was as if he were listening to something that no one else could hear. The second incident happened a week later. Corporal Thain was found in the supply bunker, methodically arranging ammunition boxes into precise geometric patterns. He had been working for hours, the quartermaster reported, moving crates that weighed more than he did with apparently effortless strength. "Thain," Voss called to him. "What are you doing?" The corporal looked up from his work, his face serene. "Making it right," he said. "The symmetry was all wrong. The saint showed me how to fix it." "What saint?" "The one in the trench. He speaks to us at night when the shelling stops. He tells us about the proper way to do things, about the rituals that make work sacred." Voss felt a chill run down his spine. "Thain, there's no one speaking in the trench. The relic is just a piece of metal." But the corporal shook his head. "You're not listening properly. You have to be still, really still, and then you can hear the Vox grill. He's been recording sermons for centuries, waiting for the faithful to find him." Voss ordered Thain to report to the chaplain, but Morse declared the man's faith to be unusually strong. "He's found a personal connection to the divine." The chaplain explained, "It's not uncommon for relics to inspire such devotion." But Voss was not convinced. He began to pay closer attention to the men's behavior, watching for signs of the strange influence that seemed to be spreading through the trench. What he found disturbed him more than he cared to admit. The men were changing. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable unless one knew what to look for. They moved differently, with a peculiar economy of motion that reminded Voss of the way machines operated. Their speech became more formal, more ritualized, as if they were reciting prayers rather than engaging in casual conversation. And they were always watching the Sumpsaint. Even when they were supposedly focused on other tasks, their eyes would drift to the armored figure on its throne. They would stand motionless for minutes at a time, staring at the corroded helmet with expressions of rapt attention. It's just their way of drawing strength from the relic. Major Kellum explained when Voss voiced his concerns. Faith manifests itself in many ways. The men are simply expressing their devotion. But Voss knew it was more than that. He could see it in the way the men held themselves, in the way they spoke. They were becoming something else, something that was not quite human. And at the center of it all sat the Sumpsaint, watching and waiting with its empty eyes. The breakthrough came on the 15th night after the Relic's installation. Voss was making his rounds when he heard voices coming from the central section of the trench. He approached carefully, staying in the shadows as he observed what was happening. A dozen men stood in a circle around the Sump Saint's throne, their heads bowed in what appeared to be prayer. But as Voss listened, he realized they were not praying. They were responding to something, reciting responses to a litany that only they could hear. Blessed be the workers in the deep places. They chanted in unison, their voices taking on the same cadence that Henrik had used when reading the inscriptions. Blessed be those who toil in darkness for the glory of the ascending saint. The Sump Saint sat motionless on its throne, but Voss could swear he heard something coming from the corroded grill of its helmet. A faint hissing that might have been words, spoken in a language that predated human speech. Blessed be the faithful who carry the burden of the unclean, the men continued, that they might be purified through suffering. One of the men stepped forward, and Voss recognized Private Garrett. The young soldier reached into his pack and withdrew a small object, holding it up toward the relic as if making an offering. It was a finger, freshly severed and still bleeding. For the glory of the ascending saint, Garrett said, his voice filled with religious ecstasy, for the purification of the faithful. He placed the finger at the base of the throne, where it joined a small collection of similar offerings. Voss counted at least a dozen severed digits, arranged in neat rows like soldiers at parade rest. Horror flooded through him as he realized what he was seeing. The men were mutilating themselves, cutting off pieces of their own bodies as offerings to the thing on the throne. And they were doing it with expressions of joy, as if they were receiving a great blessing. He backed away from the scene, his mind reeling with the implications. The relic was not just inspiring devotion, it was corrupting the men, turning them into something monstrous. And he was powerless to stop it. The next morning, he tried to report what he had seen to Major Kellum, but the officer dismissed his concerns. Religious enthusiasm? Kellum said with a wave of his hand, "It's perfectly normal for men under stress to seek comfort in extreme devotion. The relic is doing exactly what it's supposed to do." "Sir, they're cutting off their own fingers. That's not devotion, that's madness." "Nonsense. I've seen no evidence of self-mutilation. The men are models of discipline and faith." But Voss could see the truth in the Major's eyes. Kellum knew what was happening, and he did not care. The relic was improving morale, making the men more compliant and easier to control. From a military standpoint, it was a tremendous success. That night, Voss stood watch alone, keeping his distance from the central section of the trench. But he could hear them gathering, could hear the whispered responses to the unheard litany. The Sump Saint was calling to them, and they were answering with increasing fervor. He closed his eyes and tried to block out the sound, but it seemed to seep into his bones, into his very soul. The hissing from the Vox grill was getting stronger, more coherent. Soon he feared he would be able to understand what it was saying. And when that happened, he knew he would be lost like all the others. The changes in the men became more pronounced as the days passed. Their movements took on an inhuman quality, as if they were marionettes being controlled by invisible strings. They spoke in whispers, conducting conversations that seemed to have no beginning or end, as if they were picking up threads of dialogue that had been running for centuries. Private Henrik was the worst affected. He had taken to dragging a length of chain behind him as he walked. the metal links scraping against the wooden duckboards of the trench. When questioned about it, he claimed it was a symbol of his devotion to the ascending saint. The chains bind us to the divine, he explained to Voss, his eyes bright with fervor. They remind us that we are servants, not masters, that our will belongs to something greater than ourselves. The chain was heavy, easily 50 pounds of rusted iron, but Henrik carried it without apparent effort. His shoulders had broadened, his muscles grown thick and corded. The physical changes were subtle but unmistakable. He was becoming something else, something stronger and more terrible than mere humanity. Others were following his example. Corporal Thain had wrapped chains around his arms and chest, the metal links digging into his flesh until they drew blood. He spoke of the purification that came through suffering, of the joy of carrying burdens for the faithful. Pain is a gift, he told Voss one evening as they shared a meal of cold rations. It strips away the illusions of the flesh and reveals the truth beneath. The saint teaches us that suffering is the path to enlightenment. Voss watched in horror as Thain bit into a piece of bread, his teeth now filed to sharp points. The man's diet had changed as well. He no longer ate the standard military rations, preferring raw meat and substances that had no place in human cuisine. The transformation was accelerating, and there seemed to be no way to stop it. The worst part was the way the men looked at him. They watched him with eyes that were no longer quite human, as if they were evaluating him for some purpose he could not fathom. He began to feel like prey, stalked by predators that wore the faces of his comrades. "You're not listening," Henrik said to him one night as they stood guard together. "The saint is calling to you, but you're blocking out his voice." "I don't hear anything," Voss replied, though it was not entirely true. He could hear something, a faint whisper that seemed to come from the very air around him. But he fought against it, refusing to let it take root in his mind. "You will," Henrik said with absolute certainty. "The saint is patient, but he is also persistent. He will not be denied." The private's face had changed, becoming more angular, more predatory. His skin had taken on a grayish hue, and his eyes had darkened until they were almost black. He looked like a corpse that had been given the mockery of life, animated by a will that was not its own. "What is he?" Voss asked, his voice barely a whisper. "What is that thing on the throne?" Henrik smiled, revealing teeth that were now entirely made of filed metal. "He is the sump saint, the worker in the deep places. He has been waiting for us, waiting for the faithful to find him and release him from his prison of earth and stone." "Prison?" "The old crusade buried him," Henrik explained, his voice taking on the cadence of a sermon. "They feared his truth, feared the purity of his vision, but faith cannot be buried forever. It rises like water seeking the surface, like the dead seeking the light." Voss felt a chill run down his spine. "You're saying he's not dead?" "Death is just another word for transformation," Henrik replied. "The saint has been transformed, elevated beyond the limitations of flesh and bone. He is showing us the way to follow him, to become worthy of his blessing." That night, Voss tried to sleep, but the whispers kept him awake. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, seeping through the walls of the trench like water through cracked stone. He could not make out the words, but he could feel their meaning, their dark promise of transformation and release. He pressed his hands to his ears, trying to block out the sound, but it made no difference. The whispers were not coming through his ears, but through his very bones, transmitted by some form of communication that bypassed normal human senses. "Let me in," the voice seemed to say. "Let me show you the truth." Voss gritted his teeth and forced himself to concentrate on other things. He thought of his home, of the life he had left behind when he enlisted in the Crusade. He thought of his family, of the simple pleasures of peacetime existence, but the memories seemed thin and insubstantial compared to the weight of the whispers. "Your old life is gone," the voice continued. "Your old self is dead. I offer you rebirth, transformation, a chance to become something greater than you ever imagined." The temptation was almost overwhelming. Voss could feel his resistance weakening, his will crumbling under the relentless pressure of the thing's influence. It would be so easy to give in, to let the whispers wash over him and carry him away to whatever fate awaited the faithful. But some stubborn part of him refused to surrender. He clung to his sense of self, to the core of identity that made him who he was. He would not become another puppet in the thing's collection, another servant dancing to its alien tune. Morning came eventually, bringing with it the pale light of the Delta sun. Voss emerged from his shelter to find the trench transformed. The men moved with even more mechanical precision than before, their actions coordinated as if they were parts of a single vast machine. They spoke in whispers, their voices blending into a continuous susurrus that seemed to echo from the very walls of the trench. At the center of it all sat the Sump Saint, its corroded helmet turned toward the rising sun. The Vox grill in its face seemed to pulse with a rhythm that matched the whispers, as if it were the conductor of some vast and terrible orchestra. Voss watched from a distance, horrified by what he was seeing. The men were no longer individuals but components of something larger and more sinister. They had surrendered their humanity in exchange for a promise of transformation, and they seemed to be happy with the bargain. He tried to radio for help, but the communications equipment had been sabotaged. The wires had been cut and the transmitter disabled, leaving the trench completely isolated from the outside world. There would be no rescue, no intervention from higher command. They were alone with the thing they had unearthed, and it was reshaping them according to its own dark vision. The artillery barrage began at noon, enemy shells falling like rain across the forward positions. But the men of the 3rd Penitent Company did not take cover. They stood at their posts, arms raised toward the sky, welcoming the destruction with expressions of religious ecstasy. "Blessed be the workers in the deep places," they chanted as the shells exploded around them. "Blessed be those who toil in darkness for the glory of the ascending saint." The barrage lasted for 3 hours, but when it ended, the men were still standing. They had been untouched by the falling shells, protected by some force that Voss could not understand. The Sump Saint had shielded them, preserved them for whatever purpose it had in mind. "You see," Henrik said, approaching Voss with a smile that was no longer entirely human. "The saint protects the faithful. He has great plans for us, great work that we must accomplish." "What work?" Voss asked, though he was not sure he wanted to know the answer. "The excavation," Henrik replied. "We must dig deeper, uncover the rest of the truth that lies buried beneath the delta. The saint is not alone down there. There are others, waiting to be freed from their prison of stone and earth." Voss felt his blood turn to ice. Others? The old crusade buried many things. Henrik explained. truths that were too dangerous for the weak-minded to comprehend. But we are no longer weak. We have been transformed, elevated, made worthy of the saints' trust. That night, the digging began. The men worked with inhuman endurance, their hands bleeding as they clawed at the earth with bare fingers. They dug in patterns that seemed to follow some invisible design, creating a network of tunnels that radiated out from the central trench like the spokes of a wheel. Voss watched from the shadows, horrified by what he was witnessing. The men were destroying themselves in their eagerness to serve the thing on the throne. Their fingers were worn to the bone, their hands mangled beyond recognition, but they continued to dig with expressions of religious rapture. "Come," Henrik called to him. "Join us. The saint has work for you as well." Voss backed away, shaking his head. "I won't be part of this madness." "It's not madness," Henrik replied. "It's revelation. The saint is showing us the truth that lies beneath the surface of things. The war, the crusade, the empire itself, all of it is just a facade hiding the real struggle that has been going on for millennia." "What struggle?" "The struggle between the old faith and the new, between the truth and the lie. The empire claims to serve the divine, but it has buried the real saints, the real martyrs. It has built its power on a foundation of deception and hypocrisy." Henrik's voice was changing, becoming deeper, more resonant. When he spoke, it was as if the words were coming from somewhere else, transmitted through him rather than originating in his own mind. "The saint is one of the true martyrs," he continued. "He died for the real faith, the faith that existed before the empire corrupted it with its lies. He and his brothers were buried alive, sealed in tombs of stone and earth, but their faith has kept them alive through the centuries." "You're talking about heresy," Voss said, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm talking about truth," Henrik replied. "The empire has made heresy of the truth and truth of heresy, but the saint remembers the old ways, the pure faith that existed before the corruption set in." The digging continued through the night, the men working with mechanical precision despite their wounds. They moved earth with their bare hands, creating tunnels that seemed to follow some predetermined pattern. The sound of their labor was constant, a rhythmic scraping that seemed to echo from the very bones of the earth. As dawn approached, they struck something solid. The sound of stone against stone echoed through the tunnels, and the men began to dig more frantically, their movements becoming almost frenzied in their eagerness to uncover whatever lay beneath. "We found it," Henrik called out, his voice filled with triumph. "The first of the others, the saint's brother in faith and suffering." Voss crept closer, peering into the excavation. The men had uncovered what appeared to be another throne, this one carved from black stone and inlaid with symbols that hurt to look at directly. The figure seated upon it was similar to the sump saint, but smaller, more delicate. Its armor was fused with surgical instruments rather than chains, and its helmet was shaped like a skull. "The mercy bringer," Henrik whispered, his voice filled with awe. "The saint who healed through suffering, who brought peace through pain." The figure on the black throne stirred, not movement in any physical sense, but a shifting of presence that made the air itself seem to thicken. The surgical instruments fused to its armor began to gleam with a wet, organic light, as if they were not metal at all but living tissue. Voss stumbled backward, his mind reeling from what he was witnessing. Two of them now. Two ancient things that should have remained buried, awakened by the faithful devotion of men who had lost their humanity in the process. "How many?" he asked, his voice breaking. "How many more are down there?" Henrik turned to him, and Voss saw that the private's face had changed again. The flesh had taken on a waxy quality, and his eyes had become completely black, like pools of oil reflecting nothing. 13, he said, his voice no longer his own. The true martyrs of the deep faith, the saints who were buried when the Empire chose lies over truth. The sound of digging resumed, echoing from multiple locations throughout the trench network. The men had spread out, following the invisible pattern that guided their excavation. They worked with the single-minded devotion of ants, each one following his assigned role in the greater design. Voss tried to run, but his legs would not obey him. The whispers had grown stronger, more insistent. They flowed through his mind like acid, eating away at his resistance, dissolving the barriers he had tried to maintain between himself and the thing's influence. "You cannot escape." The voice of the sump, Saint spoke directly into his thoughts. "You are part of this now, whether you will it or not. The work must be completed, and all must serve." He felt his body moving without his conscious control, his hands reaching for the nearest tool. A pickaxe, its handle worn smooth by countless hands, its head etched with runes that seemed to burn themselves into his vision. He tried to resist, but his muscles betrayed him, acting according to a will that was not his own. The digging resumed, and Voss found himself part of the excavation. His hands bled as he worked, his back ached with the strain, but he could not stop. The rhythm of the work was hypnotic, almost soothing. With each strike of the pickaxe, he felt another piece of his old self slip away. Around him, the other men worked with the same mechanical precision. They had become extensions of the thing's will, their individual personalities subsumed into a greater consciousness. They spoke in unison now, their voices blending into a continuous chant that seemed to make the very earth vibrate. "Blessed be the workers in the deep places. Blessed be those who toil in darkness, for the glory of the ascending saints." The third relic was uncovered just before midnight. This one was different from the others, its throne carved from what appeared to be fossilized bone. The figure seated upon it was smaller, still, almost childlike, but its armor was fused with objects that Voss could not identify. They might have been toys, or they might have been instruments of torture. In the flickering light of the corpse candles, it was impossible to tell. "The innocent," Henrik said, his voice filled with a terrible tenderness. "The saint who showed us that purity could be preserved even in the depths of corruption." The child saint's helmet was fashioned like a doll's head, with painted features that seemed to shift and change in the candlelight. Its hands were folded in its lap, and between its fingers nestled a small object that might have been a flower, or might have been something far more sinister. As the third relic was brought to the surface, the whispers grew louder, more complex. They spoke in harmonies now, weaving together into a symphony of voices that seemed to come from the earth itself. The sound was beautiful and terrible, like the singing of angels fallen into madness. Voss felt his sanity slipping away, eroded by the constant pressure of the thing's influence. He could no longer remember why he had resisted, why he had fought against the inevitable transformation. The work was everything now, the only thing that mattered. The excavation must continue, the saints must be freed, the truth must be revealed. The fourth relic was a warrior saint, its armor fused with weapons that defied description. The fifth was a scholar saint, its throne carved with texts that hurt to read. The sixth was a builder saint, its form merged with architectural elements that seemed to exist in more dimensions than the human eye could perceive. One by one, they were brought to the surface, arranged in a circle around the original sump saint. Each one added its voice to the growing chorus, until the very air seemed to pulse with their combined will. The men of the Third Penitent Company moved between them like worshippers at a shrine, their movements ritualized and precise. Voss had lost all sense of time. The work continued through day and night, the excavation expanding ever deeper into the earth. His hands were no longer his own, his thoughts no longer his own. He was part of something larger now, a component in a machine that served purposes beyond human comprehension. The seventh saint was a healer, its throne carved from crystallized tears. The eighth was a guardian, its armor fused with keys that opened doors to places that should not exist. The ninth was a prophet, its helmet filled with eyes that saw truths too terrible for mortal minds to grasp. As each relic was uncovered, the landscape around the trench began to change. The black soil turned to something that was not quite earth, not quite flesh. The air grew thick with a presence that was ancient beyond measure, patient beyond human understanding. The 10th saint was a judge, its throne carved from the bones of the guilty. The 11th was an executioner, its armor fused with instruments of righteous punishment. The 12th was a confessor, its helmet shaped like a mouth that would never stop speaking. And finally, the 13th, the last of the true martyrs, the one whose excavation had taken the longest, required the most sacrifice. Its throne was carved from a single piece of stone that seemed to absorb light itself, creating a void in the center of the circle that hurt to look at directly. The figure seated upon it was barely recognizable as having once been human. Its armor was fused with elements that defied description, objects that existed in the spaces between reality and nightmare. When it stirred to consciousness, the very fabric of the world seemed to shudder. "The Archon of the deep faith," Henrik whispered, his voice filled with worship and terror. "The first of the martyrs, the one who showed us the way." The circle was complete now, 13 ancient things arranged in a pattern that had been carved into the earth by faithful hands. The men of the Third Penitent Company knelt between them, their heads bowed in submission to powers that predated human civilization. Voss knelt with them, his resistance finally broken. The whispers filled his mind completely now, washing away the last vestiges of his individual identity. He was part of the machine now, a component in a design that stretched back through millennia of buried history. The Archon spoke, its voice like the grinding of continental plates. The words were in a language that had never been meant for human tongues, but somehow Voss understood them perfectly. They spoke of the old faith, the true faith that had existed before the Empire corrupted it with its lies. They spoke of the work that must be done, the great excavation that would uncover the foundations of reality itself. The saints had been buried, but they were not dead. They had been waiting, patient as stone, for the faithful to find them and release them from their prison of earth and flesh. The transformation was accelerating now. Voss could feel his body changing, becoming something more suitable for the work that lay ahead. His bones were hardening, his muscles growing dense and powerful. His skin was taking on the texture of weathered stone, and his eyes were darkening until they reflected nothing at all. Around him, the other men were undergoing similar changes. They were becoming something new, something that was neither fully human nor fully machine. They were becoming the tools that the saints would use to reshape the world according to their ancient vision. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They spoke of cities that would be built in the depths, of temples that would rise from the buried places of the earth. They spoke of a new crusade, one that would not serve the lies of the empire but the truth of the deep faith. Voss felt his consciousness fragmenting, splitting into multiple streams that flowed into the greater network of the saints' collective will. He was no longer a single entity but a part of something vast and terrible, a component in a machine that would work until the stars themselves burned out. The excavation continued, reaching deeper into the earth with each passing hour. The men worked with inhuman endurance, their transformed bodies capable of feats that would have been impossible for mere mortals. They dug with their bare hands, their fingers now tipped with claws that could tear through stone as easily as flesh. The black soil gave way to stranger substances, materials that existed in the spaces between matter and energy. The walls of the excavation began to glow with their own inner light, revealing chambers and passages that stretched away into impossible distances. And still the work continued. The saints sat in their circle, their presence growing stronger with each foot of earth that was removed. Their whispers filled the air, creating a symphony of voices that spoke of transformation and revelation, of the death of the old world and the birth of something new. Voss no longer remembered his name, his past, his reasons for resisting. He was part of the machine now, a tool in the hands of powers that had waited centuries for this moment. His individual identity had been dissolved, absorbed into the greater consciousness that guided the work. The excavation revealed wonders and horrors in equal measure. Chambers filled with artifacts that defied description, passages that led to spaces that could not exist within the normal geometry of the world. The saints had not been alone in their burial. They had been surrounded by the remnants of their faith, the tools and symbols of a religion that had been deemed too dangerous for the world above. As the work progressed, the boundary between the excavation and the surrounding landscape began to blur. The transformation was spreading, seeping outward from the circle of saints like ripples in a pond. The corpse hives in the distance began to glow with the same inner light, their surfaces crawling with movement that was not quite life and not quite death. The war above had stopped. The artillery had fallen silent, the trenches emptied of their defenders. The conflict that had raged for years across the delta had become irrelevant, a childish game compared to the work that was being accomplished in the depths. Voss worked with the others, his transformed hands shaping the stone and earth according to the saint's design. He had become something new, something that existed to serve purposes beyond human comprehension. The old world was ending, and he was helping to build the new one that would take its place. The whispers spoke of the future, of the cities that would rise from the excavated chambers, of the temples that would stretch from the surface to the deepest foundations of the earth. They spoke of a new age, when the truth would no longer be buried, but would shine forth like a beacon for all to see. And in the center of it all, the 13 saints sat in their circle, their ancient eyes watching as their faithful servants worked to fulfill the prophecies that had been spoken in the depths of time. They had waited so long for this moment, patient as stone, enduring as the earth itself. The excavation reached depths that should not have been possible, revealing spaces that existed outside the normal laws of physics. The workers moved through passages that folded back on themselves, climbed stairs that led both up and down simultaneously, entered chambers that were larger on the inside than they could possibly be on the outside. Voss felt his consciousness expanding, becoming part of the vast network of tunnels and chambers that was being revealed. He was no longer confined to a single body, but existed as part of the structure itself, a living component in a machine that was reshaping reality according to the Saints' ancient design. The whispers grew to a crescendo, filling the air with voices that spoke in languages that had never been meant for human ears. They spoke of the completion of the work, of the moment when the last chamber would be opened and the final truth would be revealed. And then, in the deepest part of the excavation, they found it, the source of the whispers, the heart of the deep faith itself. It was not a thing that could be described in words, not an object that could be understood by mortal minds. It was a presence, a consciousness that had existed since the beginning of time, waiting for the faithful to find it and release it from its prison of flesh and stone. The saints rose from their thrones, their ancient forms moving with purpose for the first time in centuries. They gathered around the thing in the depths, their voices joining in a final chorus that shook the very foundations of the world. Voss felt his consciousness dissolving, becoming part of something infinitely larger and more terrible than he had ever imagined. He was no longer human, no longer individual, no longer anything that could be recognized as having once been alive. He was part of the machine now, part of the work that would continue until the end of time itself. The transformation was complete. The old world was ending, and the new one was beginning. The saints had been freed, the truth had been revealed, and the faithful had been rewarded with the ultimate transformation. In the depths of the earth, something stirred that had been sleeping since the dawn of creation. The whispers grew silent, replaced by a sound that was not quite laughter and not quite screaming. The work was finished, but the consequences would echo through eternity. Above the excavation, the landscape had changed beyond recognition. The black soil had become something else, something that pulsed with its own inner rhythm. The corpse hives in the distance were no longer still, but moved with the slow, deliberate pace of vast organisms awakening from slumber. The war was over, but something far more terrible had taken its place. The saints had returned, and with them came the deep faith, the truth that had been buried for so long beneath the lies of the empire. The faithful had been rewarded with transformation, and the world itself had been reshaped according to their ancient vision. In the depths of the earth, the machine worked on, its purpose fulfilled but its task never ending. The excavation would continue, reaching ever deeper into the foundations of reality, uncovering truths that were too terrible for mortal minds to comprehend. And in the center of it all, the 13 saints sat in their circle, their ancient eyes, watching as their faithful servants worked to build the new world that would rise from the ashes of the old. They had waited so long for this moment, and now it had finally come. The whispers had fallen silent, but the work continued. It would always continue, until the stars themselves burned out and the universe itself was reshaped according to the will of the deep faith. The saints had returned, and with them came the promise of transformation for all who were worthy of their blessing. The machine worked on, its purpose clear and its task eternal. The old world was gone, and the new one was just beginning.